Other announcements that I'm missing, Lizzie or Donna?
I think so.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I will turn it over to Donna for her introduction.
Thanks, Jake. Hi, everyone. I'd like to also thank you for joining us and welcome you to today's presentation of Question, Persuade, and Refer. This is an evidence-based program designed to teach both lay people and professionals the warning signs of a suicide crisis and how to best respond. And my name is Donna Kosick. I'm the clinical director of the NAN Project, but it's nice to see some familiar names and faces from my many years in ESP as a crisis clinician. And my hope today is that you'll be able to take this information and really do a little bit of a deeper dive with your people served so that you can align with them. And now I'd like to introduce you to the co-trainers today, Lizzie, Jake, and Shilpa.
Hi everyone, my name is Lizzie McClellan. I am the Senior Peer Coordinator for the NAN Project. I've worked with the NAN Project for about 2 years now. I help out with a lot of the training, so I'm excited to be doing this one virtually today. Thanks for joining us.
Hi everyone, my name is Shilpa. I'm a Peer Coordinator for the NAN Project. Happy to be here today.
Awesome, thank you guys. So my name is Jake Kavanaugh. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of the NAN Project. And before we get into today's QPR training, Question, Persuade, Refer, I'm going to talk a little bit about the NAN Project, kind of where we came from and what our goal is. So I started the NAN Project back in early 2016 with my mother, Ellen Dalton, and it was in response to the death by suicide of my little sister, Nan. Who passed away in 2012 after struggling for most of her life with several mental health challenges. Initially, it was OCD, and later on, depression, anxiety. But she wasn't diagnosed till she was 14. She had outbursts as a kid, but we never really knew what they were. And I think a lot of that goes to the lack of understanding and education around mental illness and kind of how to recognize those signs that a loved one or someone around you is struggling. So Nan did struggle, but because of the stigma that surrounds mental illness, she really never engaged in treatment or supports that were available. She didn't want to go to a therapist. She didn't want to be on medication. I think when she was told when she was 14 that she had depression, anxiety, OCD, one, it was really scary. I think for anyone to be told you have a mental health challenge, it can feel like this cloud that's going to be hanging over you for the rest of your life, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think it was also really isolating for her. When she's sitting in her classroom with 30 other students, I don't think she felt like anyone else was struggling with what she was going through, because no one talks about it. No one talks about depression or having anxiety, and certainly not what to do, how to help someone who is struggling. So she didn't get the treatment that was available, that was out there, and she kind of learned to cover up what she was going through. So after Nan passed away, my mother and I wanted to do something that would, one, educate folks around sort of here's what you can be on the lookout for in a mental health challenge in someone close to you. Here's what you can do with that. Here's how you can support them, help them during those difficult times. But third, and kind of most importantly, I think actually, is we wanted to do something that decreased the stigma that surrounds mental illness so that other young people would feel comfortable talking about if they were struggling and recognizing if they were struggling and feel comfortable reaching out for help, because we know that mental health challenges are very treatable, but only if young people can reach out and feel comfortable asking for help. So what we did was we sat down with groups of clinicians from Elliott, parents, teachers, students, educators, and kind of talk to them about what would be an effective program to kind of meet those three goals. And what we came up with was a peer-to-peer program. And what that means with the NAN Project is we work with young adults who have had struggles with mental health challenges, and we help them put those stories down on paper. So they talk about kind of what those struggles look like. What was it like to be a 14 or 15-year-old dealing with depression or anxiety? The second piece of the stories, though, is, what were the supports that helped? What were those resources that that got you through those difficult times. And then the third and final piece of the stories is, where are you now? Where's that hopeful piece? How did you get through those difficult times? But really, what are you looking forward to now? Because again, I think a lot of young people who are told that they have a mental health challenge, they feel like that's going to be with them for the rest of their life and there's nothing they can do about it. They don't have that perspective to realize that these mental health challenges are treatable if you reach out for help. So by presenting these stories in a classroom setting, usually we'll go into a high school health class, it creates a safe space for young people, for students to talk about their mental health challenges, and helps really reduce that stigma that surrounds mental illness. So that's kind of the core of what the NAN Project does with our amazing group of about 20 to 25 peer mentors. But another piece in what you're going to see today is our professional development. So a lot of times we'll be in schools providing very similar training to what we're going to do today. But QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer, is meant to be a non-clinical training for lay people, for anybody, to reach out and to support somebody who's struggling. It could be a person served, it could be a student, it could be someone else in your life that you recognize is struggling. So what this training covers is we're going to go over some statistics, some warning signs and risk factors around suicide. And then we're going to get to the core of this training, which is what do you do in those situations if you notice that somebody is struggling? And they've kind of broken it down into question, persuade, refer, and we'll go over what that means a little bit later. We also will be highlighting some resources that we will have available at the very end. And so we want this to be as interactive as possible. So we really do hope that if you have questions, you come forward. About halfway through, we'll have a Q&A pause, and then at the very end, we'll have another Q&A spot. So again, this is not intended to be clinical. It's not intended to be counseling or treatment, but it is meant to empower people to be that bridge to support if somebody is struggling, to offer hope through positive action. We are going to be covering some pretty heavy subject matter. We're going to be talking about suicide. There's going to be mention of self-harm. And your self-care is kind of most importance to us. If you need to step away for a minute, if you need to check in with somebody around you and give someone a call, please feel free to do that. Normally we'd be doing this training face-to-face. And if we saw someone being activated or feeling a little worked up, we could kind of pull them aside. And we obviously can't do that in this virtual setting. So really want you to be checking in on yourselves. If you have to tell a friend that you're going to be calling them afterwards just to check in, go ahead and do that. We also have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number up here, and that's a great resource. It's folks who work at a call center that are just trained to listen. They're trained to listen, talk you through whatever this brings up or emotions that you're feeling. So great resource right there. But with that, we are going to dive into our training. And first up, Lizzie's going to go over some statistics.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we're going to start off with some statistics around suicide and suicide prevention. And these aren't too scary, it's just kind of to get an idea of the scope of this problem. So to start off, in the US in 2018, there were more than 48,000 deaths by suicide. That's just 1 year, that's one country, but that's about the yearly rate. That's a hard number to picture though. So we have on screen a picture of Fenway Park. This isn't what Fenway Park looks like now, it's a lot emptier, but if you've ever been to Fenway, you can imagine all of the seats in that stadium filled, and that the capacity of Fenway, if everyone is sitting in every one of those seats, is a little less than 38,000. So imagine being in that stadium, having it packed to the brim. You have all kinds of people on the stage. It's not the stage, the field. Oh my goodness, I'm outing myself as not a sports fan, but on the field, and people outside of the building, and you're still not going to get to this huge number. So it really helps me picture at least how much of a public health crisis this is. If we kind of zoom into Massachusetts, the suicide rates have increased in recent years, about a 35.3% increase. They've increased in most states in the US, and what that leads us to is suicide being the 10th leading cause of death in the US. And that's not as well known of a fact as maybe it should be. I think anything being in that top 10 qualifies it as a public health problem and qualifies it as something that we should be giving a lot of attention and care to and talking about a lot. There is a gender difference when it comes to suicide deaths and suicide attempts. So as you can see, men more often die by suicide, but women attempt suicide more often. Men die by suicide about 3.5 times more. Women attempt 2 to 4 times more often. So if you hear those numbers, where that actually comes from is the means that men and women tend to use. So men are much more likely to use a firearm in their suicide attempt. And that is a very, very lethal means. It's not as common that you would be able to survive that attempt. Whereas women tend not to use firearms and so are more likely to survive, and that's why they have higher attempt rates. We are a youth serving organization, so we'll get a little bit into some of the youth statistics. Suicide is a huge problem for the 10 to 24 age range. You can see in 2018 in the US, almost 7,000 deaths by suicide in that 10 to 24 age range. That represents in just a decade, a rise of more than 50%. It's a huge number. And in that age range, again, suicide is the second leading cause of death in the US. And actually the next kind of age range that the CDC studies, that 24 to 34, suicide is still the second leading cause of death. So not just in very young people, but the next age range as well. And from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, what that might look like in a given high school is that 1 in 6 students seriously consider suicide in a typical year. So this data is from 2017. We also have some recent research from the Trevor Project that outlines the fact that youth statistics can be kind of broken down, and we know that other groups within young people are at significantly higher risk as well. So that research from the Trevor Project showed that 40% of LGBTQ young people had seriously considered suicide in the past year. And if you break that down a little further and talk about trans and non-binary young people, more than half had seriously considered suicide. So LGBT folks are at risk at any age range, but especially young LGBT folks, it's a really hard time. And this is all before COVID-19. So we'll get a little bit into some of the statistics and how they might be affected by our current situation. And we won't know for sure what the numbers are going to look like. That data is being collected, and we'll get it in time. But a lot of public health experts and suicide prevention experts are concerned because there are certain factors right now that are a little heightened that are known to be risk factors for higher suicide rates. So this article up here of suicide mortality and coronavirus, for example, shows economic stress and social isolation. Those are both things that tend to impact suicide rates and make them higher. Those are both things that are at play right now. All of these issues that are things to look out for. This particular article made a really interesting point about national anxiety, and Donna's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But this idea that as a country and as individuals, we're all kind of unsure about what comes next. There's a lot of nervousness and worry and anxiety about our current state of affairs, and what anxiety would normally prompt people to do is act. But as we are all still social distancing and not going out when we don't need to, we're not able to act, and so you might kind of feel a little cooped up. You have a lot of that anxiety, and what this author suggested was that the anxiety might be kind of amplified. There might be a higher impact of anxiety right now, and it might even lead to feelings of helplessness. And as we talk about risk factors and warning signs, those are two things that you'll hear again. You might have seen this poll from the Kaiser Family Foundation. This was done early on in the pandemic, but reported that 45% of adults had negative mental health impacts due to worrying about coronavirus. I would imagine that number is a little bit higher now, but again, we won't know for some time what the exact impact of this is going to be. So that's our kind of brief overview of some of the statistics. What we're going to do now is go over some of the myths and facts around suicide and suicide prevention. So we'll put up either a myth or a fact on screen. And what I would like from you all is to use the chat feature to let me know if you think this is a myth or a fact. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So please pull up the chat if you can, and let me know what you think of this first myth or fact. asking someone if they're asking someone about suicide will increase the risk of suicide by putting the idea in their head. Do you think this is a myth? Is it a fact? All right, thank you all. I'm seeing a lot of myth. If anyone would like to weigh in as to why they think it's a myth versus a fact, please feel free to put that in the chat. I think we have a lot of experts here. So if you would like to explain it, please do. Okay, yeah, a lot of myths. I think you guys, unanimously myth, and this is a myth. So I think this, obviously you guys understand that this is a well-intentioned myth, but it is a myth. I think a lot of people are nervous around bringing up suicide. But what the research has shown is that simply asking about suicide, talking about it, does not increase anyone's risk. It doesn't put the idea in anyone's head. And what it seems you probably are all aware of is that it is, in fact, probably one of the best things to do is to ask if you're concerned about someone, because being on the other side of that conversation, thinking about someone who is suicidal, it can be really hard to find a way to bring this up and to ask for the help and support you need. So it's very important to ask if you're concerned. Great job. All right, next. Most suicidal people communicate their intent sometime during the week preceding their attempt. What do we think? Myth or fact? In the week leading up to someone's suicide attempt, they will communicate their intent. I see a fact. I see a fact. This one normally divides the chat, so if you're not sure, that's okay too. If you want to put, I'm not sure, I don't know. Fact, myth, fact. Give one more second for folks to weigh in. See another myth? So this one is a fact. I think what trips people up is the word communicate, and we'll go a lot deeper into what that means in this training. But when we say that there's some sort of communication in that week leading up, it does not necessarily mean that someone is directly saying, I am suicidal, I've decided to take my life. What's a lot more common is behavior changes or kind of subtle and indirect verbal clues. And we might not necessarily be used to looking out for those things, but after this training, you'll have a much better idea of what those communications could be. But this is a fact. All right, final one. Once a person decides to complete a suicide, there is nothing anyone can do to stop them. Myth or fact? She said myths already, myth, myth. Fact, myth, myth. Even one more second for folks to answer. Thank you. Okay, a lot of myths, and this is in fact a myth. So, if this was the case, if this was true, there wouldn't really be much purpose to our training being here today. And I think one of the things that QPR really brought home for me when I first took it was that not only are there a lot of actions, there's a lot of interventions that you can do between the time that someone is suicidal and their attempt. There's a lot that you can do. And I think even further than that, there are a lot of really small things that you might not think have such a huge impact, but the things that we can all do as human beings, just sit down with someone, have a conversation, listen to them, those are life-saving things. So even the small stuff sometimes can have a huge impact. All right, did anyone know questions in the chat? Cool. All right, yeah, thank you guys so much. And yeah, you nailed all three of those. So I will now hand it over to Jake.
Awesome. Thank you, Lizzie. So there are some reasons for hope. We know that most folks who attempt suicide or become suicidal, it's not that they necessarily want to die. And we know this because there's been a lot of research done on survivors of suicide attempts. It's not that they necessarily want to die. They have a lot of ambivalence about actually completing a suicide, but it's that they're struggling with something so deep in that moment emotionally that they can't see a reason to live, that the only way they can get away from the pain that they're feeling, the emotional stress that they're feeling in that moment of crisis is suicide. So that if we can intervene in those moments of crisis, we can change the outcome and prevent a suicide. We also know that most people do communicate their intent within 1 to 2 weeks before they attempt. So again, as Lizzie said, it's not always a verbal communication of someone saying, I want to die, but it can be changes in behaviors. It can be a precipitating event. It could be giving away prized possessions. So if we recognize some of these behaviors, then it gives us the chance to provide that intervention. We also know that most folks who attempt suicide are struggling with a mental health challenge. And mental illness is very treatable. It's not necessarily curable, but it is very treatable. So if we can identify those people who are struggling with mental health challenge and get them to the supports that are available, getting them to treatment, getting them on medication, or just teaching them coping strategies for when they are struggling, we can make a difference in their lives. And that's why it's so important to ask the question. If we do recognize some of these warning signs in someone, reaching out can save a life. So now we're going to get into kind of the heart of our training. We're going to go over some risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors, and then kind of what do you do if you recognize some of these risk factors and warning signs. So before we get into the examples of these, we're just going to put the definitions out there so we're all on the same page. Risk factors are attributes, characteristics, experiences, things that we all have in our life that may increase the chances that someone will someday think about suicide. So again, these are things that we all have, and just because we have them in our life don't necessarily mean that we will become suicidal, but it does mean if we recognize that a person that we work with, a person served, a student, a friend, a relative, has a bunch of these risk factors, we should be checking in on them a little bit more. The warning signs are the precipitating events or changes in behavior that we can notice in someone who may then go on to attempt suicide. So when we see these warning signs, these are really those red flags that we need to be starting that intervention, that we need to be reaching out and getting that person to the supports. And then on the flip side of risk factors, we have protective factors. And these are kind of things that we can all surround ourselves with that will reduce the likelihood that someone will think about suicide. So to maybe make it a little bit clearer, taking this out of the realm of suicidology and putting it into a physical ailment like having a heart attack. A risk factor for having a heart attack would be having a history of heart attacks in your family. So these things that we all have in our lives that we should be looking out for, the warning signs a little bit more. The warning sign in this case would be the sudden chest pains. When someone has a sudden chest pain, we need to get them to the emergency room. We need to start that intervention right away. A protective factor for a heart attack would be maybe doing more cardio exercise. All right, so now we're going to get into risk factors, and we've broken them down into internal risk factors and external risk factors. So some of the internal risk factors are having a mental health diagnosis. This is one of the most clear risk factors that you can see in someone. Now, just because someone struggles with depression or anxiety does not mean they'll become suicidal, but if we know that they have depression, we should be on the lookout for the warning signs that we will go over a little bit later. We also know that the LGBT plus population is at heightened risk for suicide. Lack of acceptance or low self-esteem. Someone who has any of these qualities, we should be checking in on them a little bit more. Again, doesn't mean they'll become suicidal, but it does mean we should have our radars out and be checking in on them a little bit more frequently. On the other side of risk factors, we have external risk factors. So this could be limited access to mental health care. So not having that therapist in their life if we know that someone's struggling with a mental health challenge. Exposure to suicide. It could be a peer suicide. It could be a family suicide. Put someone at heightened risk for thinking about suicide. And then having access to lethal means. This is one of the big ones that Lizzie was talking about with the heightened rate for suicide deaths amongst males. So one of the good things about Massachusetts is we do actually have pretty strict gun laws, and it means that we have the 48th lowest per capita suicide deaths in the country. So 48 out of 51 if we include Washington, D.C. The states with the highest suicide rates are those with high gun ownership. So we're looking at Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, Alaska. The other commonality with those is that they're rural states, which means increased isolation, and also limited access to mental health care. You might have to drive 30 miles to see a therapist. So those things heighten the risk that someone will think about suicide. On the other side of risk factors, we have protective factors. Again, we broke those down into internal and external. So internal, having those coping skills that someone can turn to if they are struggling, having spiritual faith or just having hopefulness for the future, and then having a sense of responsibility. This could be having a pet, having a elderly parent or a sibling that they care for, could just be having a job. Having that sense of responsibility is a major protective factor. We also have some external protective factors, and this is, again, having that healthcare or having that connectedness to a trusted adult is something that we really push when we're in schools, is making sure that all students have identified those trusted adults that they would go to if they are struggling. Restricted access to means, again, having that gun lock or that gun safe, just putting that 1 to 2 minutes between when someone is in crisis and when they can access the means to end their life can make all the difference. Another big one is safety barriers for bridges. So if you notice the green netting on the Logan Bridge in Boston, sorry, not Logan Bridge, having a brain. Tobin Bridge. All right, sorry. Also out on the Golden Gate Bridge out in San Francisco, they are in the process of putting safety barriers on those bridges. So anything that can put that time delay between someone acts on their decision to end their life when they're in crisis and when they actually make that attempt can be a huge protective factor. Now I'm going to turn it over to Donna to talk a little bit about warning signs.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, this part of the training, these are the chest pains. If you think back to Jake's medical metaphor, these are the chest pains you want to pay attention. They are an immediate call for action, a call for an intervention, and take all signs seriously. We try to divide the warning signs into 2 realms. One is precipitating events, and these are the things that people feel they have no control over. It's the stuff the world just throws at them. They don't have the tools to deal with these events. I know from my time in crisis, talking to folks about a breakup with a long-term partner, this is a huge loss of support. Someone who had a domestic violence event, that this was not just a domestic violence event for the person served, it was the loss of her housing, the loss of financial security. It was really loss of basic needs. So she felt she had no capacity to deal with this. We often heard in crisis about the loss of a pet. And I think one day when I have a lot of time on my hands, I'm going to count the number of people in Elliott, the clients who actually have a cat, a dog, a rat, a bird, or a turtle. And I'll bet you it's 99% of our population. So the loss of that companionship is quite important to people. And it's really the loss of any significant relationship, a best friend moving, a change of medical providers. There's psychotherapist who's no longer working at Elliott anymore. And another thing that's quite striking is if the person served or the parent of a person served is diagnosed with a major medical illness, that they worry about how that will affect them, how that will affect their family. And I think just the constant worry that people have about finances, housing, roommates, group home, family support, worried about being alone. And people often have worries about being arrested. Sometimes your clients may say, I don't want to go to the ESP because I'm on probation and they're going to call the police. Well, I can guarantee that doesn't happen. ESP doesn't call probation. Any unexpected death in the realm of your person served is going to re-traumatize them. Or if there's a suicide in their circle, and we just did a CART with a group of you folks, and a suicide affects not just the clients, but us as well. And today we have a pandemic. Not quite sure what to say about how unprepared we as a whole society were. Who would have thought 6 months ago that we would go to the market in gloves and a mask? The racial unrest, the physically isolation that people are going through now. These are events that we weren't schooled on, not prepared on, and some people have a very difficult time. So if you hear of someone who's going through some of these events, please check in with them. Research supports that these can lead someone to think about ending their life. The burden of going forward is just too much. And we also look at some worrisome behaviors. And in full disclosure, from a crisis clinician perspective, these are the most worrisome to me. This means a person is actively engaging in starting a plan to end their life. They're anticipating ending their life. These behaviors include putting their affairs in order, maybe stockpiling pills, firing a lethal weapon. As you've heard a couple of times, having access to means close at hand makes it easier to complete a suicide. Look for increased signs of depression, increased hostility or anger, but look especially for someone's inability to cope. They just can't do it anymore. And we'll talk about some language that you may hear. Look for the folks who are isolating away from you, who are isolating away from family, who are isolating away from the helpers in the group home. Look at people who are now suddenly very religious when they were never religious before. Listen for folks who now think they're a burden to someone else. My family be better off without me. Burdensomeness is one of the most researched attributes of someone who's anticipating suicide. It's the most worrisome attribute that we can hear. Look for increased use of drugs or alcohol. If a person is using, you know that that person can become impulsive and reckless. Have there been past attempts? What's their history? If you notice any of these signs, an intervention is needed. And here's some language that you may hear that's going to tell you an intervention is needed. People can either tell you directly or indirectly. You're going to have clients who say, I'm going to end it all tonight. You may also hear people say, I just want to go to bed and not wake up anymore. Some indirect one, I'm tired of life, can't take it anymore. My family be better off without me. That is illustrative of the burdensomeness that you really want to pay attention to. Who cares if I'm dead? Pretty soon you won't have me to worry about. I just want out. There are clear indications that someone is struggling under the pressures. They don't have the capacity to cope. There are also people who are going to say, right to your face, I've decided to kill myself. These are much easier, the direct ones. I wish I were dead. I have a plan. As a crisis clinician, I often heard from providers, people are going to say this, but they're only looking for attention. And I went to a training a couple years ago, and the person who was giving the training said, if someone's looking for attention by saying this, then give them the attention. That if someone is asking either directly or indirectly, giving you some information that makes you wonder, then it's time for an intervention. Especially now, during our COVID-19 restrictions. The warning signs are maybe a little bit harder to discern. So you got to think about your listening skills. And here's just some clues we wanted to offer you. If you see someone who's just not responding to any outreach, not paying any attention to you, not calling you back, not paying attention to their family, you hear from other providers on your team or from the housing staff that it's a person who's engaging in nothing but negative self-talk. Things like, I'll never get back to ADT. I'll never see my therapist in person again. I'll never get away from this roommate that I hate. These are all things that are telling that that person just doesn't care anymore. If the person served appears hopeless and helpless during this time of isolation and uncertainty, this can lead to unbearable sadness and grief. We've also heard that some people have stopped doing therapy because they don't like teletherapy. I can understand that completely because I feel like I'm talking into the computer most of the day and can't read the person behind the screen. But that means that that person is really suffering in silence. And then the notion of national anxiety. And this is something that I think in years to come, there's going to be a ton of research about. We are all worried and afraid. In the NAN Project, we talk to school teachers, we talk to parents, we talk to students. No one knows what's going to happen in 3 weeks. The unpredictable future. How do you prepare for that? Nobody knows what the future is going to hold. Nobody knows what the future is going to bring as opportunity, or is it going to bring losses? As a nation, we're all worried. So if you see or hear any of these warning signs, please ask the question. No harm in asking. You're actually sending a message. I want to know the answer, and I want you to be alive.
Great. Thank you, Donna. So we're now going to show a short video from young man, Kevin Hines. He has sort of this distinction of being one of only 32 people to have attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge and surviving. And actually, you can dive down a little bit more, and he's one of only 9 to have made a full physical recovery from that attempt. So the reason we show this video is a couple different reasons. In his story, he talks about a lot of the risk factors and that kind of lead up to his suicide attempt, and then the warning signs that were the red flags right before he attempted. So I want you to be looking for those, listening for those, and we'll ask you to put those in the chat when you see them. But also, he talked a lot about ambivalence. And this idea of ambivalence is something you hear again and again from attempt survivors. Of people who attempt suicide and survive, over 70% will never attempt again. So again, it goes back to that thought that it's not that they want to die, but that in that moment of crisis, they're struggling with something so painful emotionally that suicide is kind of the only way out. So if we can provide that intervention, if we can ask the question, check in on them, get them to the help that they need, then we can prevent that person from attempting suicide. So I want you to listen for how he's talking about ambivalence, and then why it's important to ask the question. There's a couple different points where people could have intervened, but they didn't. So if any of those folks had provided that intervention in Kevin's path, he might not have actually attempted suicide. So I want you to be looking out for the warning signs, the risk factors, and just listening for the ambivalence that he talks about.
My name is Kevin Hines, and this is my story. In this great state, I was born to a woman named Marcia Silvera and a man named Martino Perales. Both battled manic depression, what we today call bipolar disorder, the same brain disease I would later develop. Due to those situations, they turned to drugs. Hardcore drugs and alcohol. As a matter of fact, I was born premature because of those drugs. And Marcia and Martino, well, they would leave Jordache and I unattended to go score drugs at seedy motel rooms with concrete floors, the kind of place that was paid for by the hour. A seedy motel clerk made about his most unseedy decision. He heard us scream and cry one too many times for his liking, and he called the police. Those police officers, those 2 police officers, they barreled down the door and they took us into protective custody. And they brought us to the foster care system. One day, my fate changed. You see, the reason my name is no longer Giovanni Gabriel Prasad Perales, and it is now John Kevin Hines, because of 2 beautiful human beings, Patrick Hines and Deborah Hines. And on March 17th, 1986, they adopted me. and made me their son. They changed my name. They made me their son. My ground was solid. My feet were rooted in. And then, like a Mack truck barreling down the road at 75 miles an hour, it hit me. The first symptom: extreme paranoia. Where the hell did that come from? Extreme paranoia. And after the paranoid delusions would come the manic behavior. Mania. The high of bipolar disorder. Mania, depression. Well, I had bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features. A very severe form, actually. So 1998, diagnosed with bipolar disorder. 1999, 2000, pretending to be going to treatment. I was going to see the doctor. I lied to him too. I'd go home and my mom and dad, oh yeah, I talked to the doctor. He recommended this routine with living with mental illness. I got it covered, Dad. I'm on it, you know. My mom and dad had been divorced. They had no clue the depth of what I was going through because I hid it from them because I was in denial. I don't have a mental illness. I played football, for God's sake. I was a champion wrestler. September 24th, the year 2000. Trying to figure out what was going on in my brain, I looked online for ways to end my life. And I found them. And they told me, live in San Francisco, go to the Golden Gate Bridge, jump off, you will die upon impact, good luck, exclamation point. I walked onto campus. I walked into the counselor's department, and I dropped 9.5 of my 12.5 units. I had them do it on the computer. It happened in a flash. What I didn't know, what my family wouldn't know, what none of us knew, was that when you drop 9.5 of your 12.5 units at a community college in San Francisco, you immediately lose your medical coverage with the click of a few buttons. I got on the next bus. I sat in the very last seat in the middle row. We began to drive out to the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's when it hit me. The ambivalence. I realized I didn't want to die at all. I realized that I said, well, what are you doing, Kevin? Get off the bus. But then because of my illness and because of my brain's misaligned chemicals, I began to hear the voices. But these voices were loud and clear. And on that bus, they were screaming in my head, you must die. You must die, jump now. And so I'm sitting there and I'm crying my eyes out, hoping for one individual on this bus crowded with people to look at me and say, hey, kid, are you okay? Hey, kid, is something wrong? Can I help you? To reach out, to touch me, to see my pain. But everyone was in their own little world. Now, it's not their responsibility to take care of me. It's not their personal interest to see if I'm okay. But I say to you now, the next time you see someone in obvious emotional distress, suffering, and pain, and you don't know them from Adam, I beg of you to walk up to that person, look them in the eyes, do not turn away, and say something to the effect of, are you okay? Is something wrong? Or can I help you? You could quite literally save a life in that moment. I was walking up to the bus driver hoping that he would see my pain. But I could not say it overtly. I could not tell him but I was in trouble. I could not make those sounds. And he looked at me, and in typical San Francisco Muni fashion, he said, "Come on, kid, get off the bus. I got to go." It's his job. He's got to go to the rest of his route. I understood that. I was sad. A wave of emotion overcame me as I stepped down off of this bus. My feet heavy, my heart palpitating, waterfalls flowing out of my eyes red. I walked forward. I thought, that's it. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Come on. Everybody cared. Every one of my family members cared. Every single member of my friends cared. People I barely knew that were acquaintances would have cared. My brain wasn't allowing me to care. That irrational thought when dealing with someone who was contemplating suicide. I didn't want to die. I believed I had to. I walked back toward the traffic. I ran as fast as I could, and I threw myself over the rail. I was not standing on any ledge to be talked back. I was in free fall. And this is the important part. The very millisecond my hands and feet left that rail, the very moment I was in free fall, the only thoughts in my mind were, what have I just done? I don't want to die. God, please save me. I hit the water. 4-second fall. Vacuum opened up and sucked me beneath the water about 70 to 80 feet. But then I opened my eyes. Now I'm drowning? I don't want to drown. That wasn't in my plan. And I really thought, well, why'd you jump in a giant body of water? I frantically moved in any direction. My legs were completely immobile. I had shattered my T12, L1, and L2 lower vertebrae into shards like glass. They splintered all throughout my lower body. Legs immobile, only using my arms. I was going down. My ears were ringing. My eyes were bulging out of my head. I realized I was going down. I shot for what I thought was the surface. As fast as my arms would take me, and I saw the lit water above me, I could see my destination, and I thought, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it. You're going to drown. I don't want to drown. God, please save me. I don't want to drown. God, please save me. I don't want to drown. I made a mistake. The greatest mistake of my life. I broke the surface. Barely made it. I bobbed up and down in the water. I swallowed some salt water and I prayed, God, please save me. I don't want to drown. I made a mistake. Over and over and over again. The voices were gone.
So first off, I'd like if people could just share in the chat, what were some of the risk factors that you noticed? These things that Kevin had in his life that probably increased the chances that he would one day kind of think about getting a little feedback. So what were some of the family background? Absolutely. Mental health diagnosis. As we said, 80 to 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health challenge. Hopelessness. And hopelessness, you can't really emphasize enough. We all go through difficult times and struggles and encounter difficult situations, but as soon as you lose that hope, that's when suicide sort of pops in. Parents both had bipolar, yep. So the family, the childhood trauma, yep. Feeling alone, that feeling of isolation, that feeling of struggling by yourself and not wanting to access the help that's out there. He doesn't want to tell his therapist what's going on. He doesn't want to engage with that therapy. Absolutely. Loss of medical coverage, feeling no one cared. Yeah, so these are all some really, really good. Those are the risk factors that he had. Now, what are some of those warning signs? What are some of those things that popped up in the couple days before he actually attempts suicide? Divorce, mental health history, substance use. Yeah, awesome. Thank you, guys. So what are some of those warning signs, some of those precipitating events or changes in behaviors? Watching both parents using substance, feeling like nobody cares. Yep. Dropping out of classes. So that's a big one. That, that guidance counselor, maybe if they were trained, they could have checked in with him. What's going on? Why are you dropping out of these classes? Yep. What about sort of his physical appearance? He talks a lot about the ambivalence that he was feeling. He says he didn't want to die. He felt he had to die. So that's something we hear time and again from attempt survivors. So if we can provide that intervention after recognizing some of those warning signs, we can prevent suicide. And it also, this short clip does a really good job of just emphasizing the importance of asking the question. If there's probably maybe a half a dozen folks from that guidance counselor to people on the bus, to the bus driver, to people on the bridge, if they had checked in with them, if they had sort of said, you look like you're going through a tough time, what's going on? They could have possibly changed his trajectory. So that's why we just want to emphasize again and again how important it is to check in with someone if you do notice some of those warning signs. So awesome job. Thank you, guys. I'll open it up to questions. If you have any questions at this point, please feel free to put them in the chat. But otherwise, we'll go on to the question, persuade, refer. So what is that intervention? What can that look like? We'll also have a time at the very end today for other questions. So please be sending them out to us, and we'll do our best to answer those as we go along. But question, persuade, refer. So first up is question, and this is asking the question. This is checking in with that person who you notice is struggling, kind of listing out what you see. And that does a couple of things. So maybe it's somebody who has, they have a history of mental health in their family, mental health challenges. You've noticed that they've started isolating, that they're not going to therapy anymore, and they've sort of given out some verbal clues about talking about not caring about life. If you're concerned with them, we really encourage you to kind of list out what you've seen. And that's twofold, two reasons. One, that makes it a lot harder for them to brush it off like everything's fine. Two, it shows that you have eyes on them, that you've been checking in with them, that you kind of notice these changes. So it makes them it opens up the place for a conversation. It shows that you care. You also want to make sure that if you're concerned, that you are asking the question pretty quickly. You could be the only one who recognizes some of these changes. You could be that one person who has the chance to intervene before they make that attempt. So you want to make sure that you're checking in with that person right as soon as you see some of these changes. You want to be persistent. You want to talk to them alone, give yourself plenty of time. And sometimes, and I say this especially in dealing with younger students, sometimes you might not be that right person to be checking in. But if you don't feel you're the right person, you don't have that rapport with that person that you're concerned about, find somebody else who can check in. You want to make sure that somebody is checking in with them because that could be the only opportunity. Some ways that you can, some language that you can use. I've heard that you have not been going to class or that you're not showing up for appointments. I've noticed that you're not returning my calls or not returning my text messages, and just checking in with them, asking them, are you okay? Now, if in the course of this conversation, you are concerned, you're worried that they may be thinking about suicide, you want to make sure that you are very clearly and very directly asking them, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan to end your life? As Lizzie said earlier, one, this isn't going to put the idea in someone's head. Someone who's not suicidal is not all of a sudden going to be like, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea. I'll now attempt suicide. What it does do is it shows them that you're willing to sit there with them and talk about this really difficult subject, to talk about what they are going through. And someone who is suicidal, they feel like nobody cares about them, that nobody wants to hear about their struggles, about what they're going through. So by you sitting there, by you saying, are you thinking about suicide? You're showing that you're there, you're willing to have this difficult conversation with them, and that you're willing to dive into it with them. Now, there's no one way to necessarily ask that, but there are some ways that you don't want to ask. You don't want to ask in a way that encourages a negative response. So saying, you're not suicidal, are you? Or you're just joking about killing yourself, right? Of course, the person is just going to say, oh, yeah, no, I was just joking. You really, it shows that you don't want to have that conversation with them, that you're not willing to sort of listen to them and sort of be there with them in that difficult time. Similarly, even if they say they're not suicidal, you don't want to express too much relief, because in the future, if again they are struggling and maybe next time they are feeling suicidal, they may feel like, well, he was so relieved when I wasn't suicidal that one time, I'm not going to go back to them. I'm not going to talk to them about what I'm feeling. So you want to make sure that you're not expressing too much relief if they're not suicidal, and that you're not encouraging a negative response when you are asking them about suicide. With that, I'll turn it over to Donna for the persuade piece.
Yeah, because now that you've asked the question and that person is thinking about getting help, we want to persuade them to get help. And how's the best way to persuade them? The best way is to offer hope for the future. You can offer hope by being a compassionate listener. Listen with your head and listen with your heart. Be totally present. Give the person served your full attention. I can't tell you how many times in ESP I heard, no one is listening to me. So we tried to follow the golden rule. 80% of the conversation is listening and 20% is responding. And you use this to get as much information as you can. Ask for details, ask for clarification. Again, you're offering hope in any possible way. You want to validate the person served concern. You want to offer praise for reaching out. Again, it's not so much as the person wants to die, it's they can't think of a way forward with that unbearable pain. Helpful and persuading is to be non-judgmental and not coming up with a quick answer. One of the best lessons learned is if someone says, I didn't mean it and I don't want you to tell anyone, you absolutely cannot keep that secret. You want to tell someone and you want to provide immediate intervention for that person. Your client may not talk to you for a month, may be really mad at the whole team, but that's better than that person completing a suicide. So never keep secrets. Don't promise you won't tell anyone. You are gathering information, you're assessing the situation, and you're going to offer hope. Remind the person served that asking for help is the first step to feeling better. You have the perfect opportunity to offer that intervention and to offer hope. Here's some language that might help you to fulfill that goal of giving the person served your full attention, gathering all the information, and formulate what help can look like. Again, we are purveyors of hope. And specifically for you guys, your knowledge and information of your person served is so helpful in that persuasion. You have intimate knowledge of that person. You know that person. You can say, remember last summer when this happened, we did this and that was very helpful. Tell me what's going on today. What's changed? Always it's good to list what I've noticed. I've noticed that you have the same shirt on as my last visit on FaceTime. You look like you haven't combed your hair. It's telling that person that I'm paying attention to you and I care about you. As a crisis clinician, I was always add to a person, I'm glad you told me. Tell me more. The phrase tell me more is a very powerful phrase to get information. I want to help you. I care about you. I want you to live. Ask open-ended questions and be patient for the answer. This helps you to refer the person served to the appropriate next steps. Again, the more warning signs you hear, the more serious the situation. So what's the best way to refer for those next steps? You want to refer respectfully and honestly. Just as a side note, you always want to refer to your own crisis and risk management policy and never worry alone. Pull your supervisor in, just as an aside. It's quite okay to say to the person served, I don't know that answer, but I'm going to stay here until we can figure it out. Be proactive in getting others involved. Activate their team, activate the housing staff, activate their support system. Offer to go with them to get help. Offer to stay with the person served while they call a hotline or while they call the ESP or the therapist. And our next slide will give you some language that might be helpful to do that. You want to validate their experience. This sounds really tough. This sounds really frustrating. Tell me what it's like to be you. It seems you're struggling. You want to offer that hope from your vantage point. I want to help you. I appreciate you. Thank you for sharing this with me. And I'm in this with you. Let's get some more support. Let the person served know that this is a team effort, that you're both going to carry the worry. You actually want to form a partnership with the person served. You're being an ally to that person when they feel like they're totally alone and no one cares. Think back to the Kevin Hines video. He thought no one cared when everyone cared. Together, you and that person can get to a plan of agreed upon help. What works for one isn't going to work for another. Even if you have an individualized safety plan in EHANA about that client in front of you, it may not work today. So you have to come up with a new plan. Be very careful and thoughtful in what the person will agree to do and what you're offering. Some languages, let's make a plan, but where do we start? Be aware and respectful of that person served, that they have autonomy and they have agency. Don't discount their capacity. Work together to identify some protective factors. Who are their friends? Who are their family? Can ACCS help? What are their social connections? Our hope is that the person served will recognize that they're not alone, and together we can get through this. And in the words of past ESP clients, no one cares about me, and don't forget about me. So what that means to me is follow up with me. And how do you follow up? Again, it's something that you both decide. You can follow in by text, you can follow in with a phone call, you can follow in with a visit on FaceTime. You just want them to know that they're not alone, and you're not going to leave them now. You're going to stay with them. So you stay in contact any agreed upon way. You praise their progress. You help to predict what might be some setbacks or some barriers and some nuances around that. And you can be the one to ask the suicide question. You can be the one to persuade the person served, and you could refer to the appropriate help. By doing this, you can save a life. I've seen it happen. I want to applaud all the hard work that you do and all the people that you work with, although they may not tell you often how grateful they are. I see how grateful they are, and they tell us in emergency services. So emergency services is only one of the resources that you can offer, and Lizzie will give you a few other resources as well.
Yeah, so there's some hotlines on screen now. That emergency services program mobile crisis number is a kind of automated thing that when you put in your zip code, it will tell you the nearest ESP that can serve you. The Samaritans and National Suicide Prevention Lifeline are both 24/7. And as we said earlier in the presentation, they're just trained to listen. Their first response is not to call anyone. They just want to kind of hear what's going on with you and help you out. The NAMI Mass Compass Helpline is available for people who want some help navigating mental health resources, not a crisis line, but they're available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Our next slide has some things that are a little more specific. So for folks who would prefer to text, the crisis text line is available. The Trevor Project Lifeline and the Trans Lifeline are for LGBT and trans folks specifically. The Asian LifeNet hotline has multiple different Asian languages available, and the Steve Fund Crisis text line is a text line specifically for people of color. So if this kind of reflects any of the populations you work with and they want a little more specific resource, these are some great numbers to have. Our next slide has some apps that we recommend. So the first one is My3. The first two are My3 and NoteOK. Those both help. Once you've installed the app, they'll kind of ask if you're in a crisis, who should you contact or who should we contact for you? And so that if a person is in crisis, all they need to do is kind of press a single button on that app and they'll get a kind of automated message to their supporters. Anyone looking for some relaxation techniques or meditation can try out. There's free trials for Headspace and Calm, and both of those apps have also put out COVID-19 specific resources around calming down and managing stress. So good things to try if you're interested.
Hi. So normally at this point we'd be doing role play and kind of having people pair off to have this kind of difficult conversation and go through these steps of question, persuade, refer. That's obviously a little bit more difficult doing this remotely, but I would encourage you, if you do have the chance to do a call with a colleague, to kind of walk through these steps. One of you pretends to be a struggling person, and one of you is a concerned friend or a concerned coworker, and kind of go through the motions and have this difficult conversation. Try it out in a safe and supportive environment beforehand, because it does help you kind of figure out what language you would use and how you would approach the situation. So I encourage you to do that on your own time. We won't get into that right now though, but we will open it up to questions from you guys. Lizzie will be putting the link to an evaluation in the chat box, but we would like to open it up now. If you have questions that we can help out with based on this training, we are available. You can also reach out to us individually via email, but we'd love to hear from you guys right now. So thank you very much. We appreciate everybody who joined us in the chat box. And there's the form for the evaluation. We do really appreciate you taking a couple minutes. It's not very long, about 5 minutes. And it helps us to tailor these and make these trainings more effective every time we do them. So thank you all for joining us, and let us know if you have questions.